Good evening. Welcome to the Plymouth Charter Commission. This is the regular meeting of the Charter Commission, meeting in the Great Hall in a hybrid model. We're in person as well as via a Zoom webinar, and we can be viewed live on the local government cable channel 15, Comcast, and channel 47, Verizon. This meeting is being recorded. Zoom attendees must register using the Zoom webinar link on the Charter Commission page on the town website. Zoom attendees for public comment, please use the raise hand icon on the lower corner of your screen. In-person audience for public comment, use the podium and place your name on the sign-in sheet. So we'll begin tonight with a Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Let's see, we're all here tonight in person. Larry Pizer is on Zoom. David Malaguti and David Peck have other engagements. They will not be here. But we do have a quorum, and we are proceeding. I just want to make a couple of comments on the scheduling. The next meeting of the commission will be in 2 weeks from tonight, which is June 23rd. And then the last meeting in June will be the following Monday, June 27th, I believe that is. So tonight, we will be backtracking a little bit to do some cleanup on Chapter 2, and then move forward through the executive branch, the select board, the town manager, and we may not get to the planning board, but that is also in Chapter 3 of the Charter, and it's a very important section. We need to finish the executive branch, including the planning board, basically this month. After June, we have 3 months to go before the preliminary draft is due. So between now and 2 weeks from tonight, a couple things I hope will happen. One, we will circulate an up-to-date charter with all the changes that have been agreed to, including this evening. As soon as we can do that after tonight's meeting, so you'll have a chance to see it before the next meeting in 2 weeks. And second, if you would continue to read in the Chapter 3, Select Board, Executive Branch chapter, which we're going to be dealing with tonight, but also read to the end of it, see if there's anything in there that you think needs to be fixed. Highlight it for the commission. If you could send me an email, I'll be sure it gets on the agenda and we won't miss it in 2 weeks. I think that'll be an efficient way to see if there's anything else there. There are some of those issues we're going to take up tonight. One final word is during the course of our deliberations, at times people here have said, commissioners have said, they want such and such, a few words just to say this or a few words to say that. But look, I would like to ask you to start some drafting. We have enough editors, we don't have enough writers. Basically it's just us. We have to do the drafting with the help of the Collins Commission, but it's our job to get the thing drafted. So we need some original drafts that I'm sure there'll be plenty of us to edit it. But if everybody contributes, if you feel strongly about something, write it up as a draft language we can actually review, edit, and decide whether it's going to go into the charter. So we will have one member of the Collins team here tonight. Libby is expected, but not until about 7:15. If anybody doesn't have any further questions or comments, let's just dig right in. I sent to you all today when I received it, the memorandum number 6 from Mike Ward and the Collins Project team. What they did was go back and cover a couple of things in Chapter 2 and then had some thoughts on Chapter 3. So let's just go through that. There's a couple of things I want to clean up tonight myself. I wasn't sure which way the language had been agreed to. There are three of those points we can deal with when we come to them in a couple of minutes. So the first item from Chapter 2 that was still not completely finished was the re-precincting provisions. And basically, the memorandum on pages 1 and 2 discusses the re-precincting provision and has two alternatives. This is 2-1-1. The two options, one starts with and recites the 10-year census and how that leads to the redistricting in town. And then remember, we had a second paragraph there that dealt with a 5-year interim look at the population and so forth. So they've come up with two different ways of handling that based on the discussion we had at our last meeting. One is to refine that language, the 5-year thing. But the other option is to basically defer the 5-year update until 1 year prior to the 10-year re-precincting. And you see that's on page 2. And in the 9th year, after the previous redistricting, this committee would be appointed. So it's basically a year before the big 10-year re-precincting. And then you'll see that it says the town should, it deals with the appointment. It says the Precinct Advisory Board shall study the town's precincts and population prior to the release of the final results of the decennial federal census, which it's anticipating is going to happen sometime the next year. Shall review the final results of the census upon receipt and shall propose any changes that the board deems necessary to the select board. Then hold public hearings to solicit public input. I think there's one little fix we need to say here is when the precinct board will actually be appointed. I think it should, if it's going to work, it should be appointed early in that 9th year, say like by January 31st as a possibility, but I think we should be specific when the board will be appointed. So those are the two options before us. One is fixed at 5 years, the other is basically an early start to the 10-year process. So let's discuss that. Open for comment. Bill, go ahead.
So I'm just going off of my observations over the years as we have moved from, in the last 20 years, we've moved from, 10 and 11 precincts up to now, we're looking at 18. So I guess my thought process was that should be in the charter that it's a given that at 10 years, when this information comes out by the federal government of a census, that the selectmen are in charge of this redistricting, but they will form a committee that will look at those numbers. This 9th year is doing exactly what Larry had reservations about, that the 5th year would be the same situation but better. And that is, in the 9th year, we still don't have the federal census numbers available. The thought was that at every 10 years, there would be a group put together to work with the clerk's office, to work with the selectman's office, to look at the federal numbers and come up with the redistricting. So in the end, the selectmen have to make the decision, but this group would be compiling the information with the clerk, handing that information over. I don't really catch the understanding of let's start a year early because these numbers don't come out. That was one of the things that we grappled with. We didn't really have the numbers in 2020 until late into 2021. So that was unusual because usually in January of that year, they would release, in January of 21, they should have had the census numbers out for the year 2000, but they didn't come out until very late in the year. The only information that we had as a town is what the Donnelly Institute put out from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Every 10 years, they provide out of the kindness of their heart. There's no law requiring them to do this, that this institute, at UMass, generates these maps and gives them to the towns, and then the towns kind of play with those. But there was no follow-up information. We were kind of just standing there on standby. So this idea of doing it on the 9th year doesn't really solve the problem. I just want to make sure that every 10 years, when the census comes out and those numbers are out, and Donnelly has produced the maps, that the Board of Selectmen will appoint this committee to work with the clerk to advise them on these precincts. Now, the idea of the 5 years is that at 5 years, that the selectmen would appoint this group to revisit how things are going, because the town grows so rapidly. That was the idea of my 5-year, you know? So does that make any sense, Russell?
Okay,
You're looking at
Russell?
me.
Well, I kind of confused, because I thought you were one of the proponents of having it before that 10 years. Okay. Okay. I think that, the only problem I have with the second option is, like the chair said, it needs to be nailed down, the date. I also think that it needs to be nailed down that this group will be formed by the precinct chairs and the select board. I think that, as Larry said last time, he has a sense. And I think that, you know, we keep discussing that we're not going to have the actual numbers. But I think the purpose of this group is to be ahead of the game. So that, yeah, we're not going to have the actual numbers, but I think from voter registration and how the votes are going, we might have a better sense. I don't know whether at 5 years or at 9, which is better, but I do think that the language has to be pretty definite of when this is going to happen, and that the precinct chairs and the select board will create this group.
Okay, I think on your 2 points, Wesley, first as to the appointment process, they tried to fix that by saying the select board and the committee of precinct chairs shall appoint the members of the committee. And then it goes on to say, but neither one shall appoint multiple members from the same precinct.
Yep,
They split
I
it
get
into
that.
2 parts, that sentence, so it's clear that it's really a prohibition on both of them separately. So I think the appointment works.
Yep.
As far as whether the 9th year or the 5th year, I don't know, it just seems intuitively to make sense to me that in the 9th year, you're going to have more information in the 5th year as to what the situation is going to be in the 10th year. I mean, basically, it's only a year off. You already have some ideas of where the growth has taken place, and it's not going to be quite as in the dark as it would have been the 5th year interval. So that's why they're suggesting 9 years, time to start thinking about re-precincting, get into that mode, get the committee appointed, gets all geared up. I mean, it seems like that kind of works as it then moves through the 9th year, and all of a sudden, we're in the 10th year, and the information starts coming down. I mean, you know, that seems to make sense, logically.
I'm okay with that. Frank had a,
Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering if we couldn't have language artful enough to consider that circumstances change, such as language that suggests no later than 1 year before the date of the census or the, expectation, but that allowed would be if there is considered to be a need that the group could be formed earlier.
Right.
If we do that, then, because it could happen that, I mean, I'm watching these high-rises go up in Colony Place. Suddenly, we could have,
So who makes the call, Frank?
well, I think the select board
Yeah, that's the
would make the call. And it wouldn't be in anyone's, it'd be in everyone's best interest, if that's the case, to have an earlier rather than, that 9-year period.
So would you look to both the COPC and the select board?
Well, the appointments would still be made by both.
So they both have to agree that this is the time to take
I
off?
don't think they both have to agree that this is the time. I think it's just they both get an equal share in the people that are going to be on that committee.
I'm personally okay with Frank's having it, it's got to be, has to be within a year, but if needed before that, I'm okay with that.
So,
I think
Betsy,
that's
go
it.
ahead. Yeah, you jump in.
Yes, I'm imagining myself, which I always do, sitting on this committee at the 5-year period and saying, okay, we've got precinct 1 is getting big. And then what happens next? So I'm on this committee,
Yeah.
we've made this determination, and then we go back to the select board and we say precinct 1 is, 1,000 over. Then what happens next?
So, as Larry has indicated, and Larry could probably follow up and explain what the limitations are, between the census, there are limitations in how much you can play with the precincts. There's limitations.
So really nothing will come of it?
So, well, let me, this is, I
Okay.
just wanted to say this, is that the 5-year plan was to check in on things, that at the pleasure of the Board of Selectmen, at 5 years, if they wanted to put together a working group to work with the clerk and to examine how the precincts are performing, that they could go ahead and do that. And they would be appointed by the precinct chairs and the selectmen, and they would go and look at how things are going after 5 years. This might draw attention to some of the issues that did develop in between the last 2 censuses, where you did have precincts that were experiencing issues. And the selectmen tried to address it. I think there was a precinct that they were thinking about moving it out of a location, but it became a political hot potato, and they stayed away from it. I'm just saying that every 5 years, because this town is growing so fast, and that we want to make the political process, the electoral process accessible and enjoyable in getting people to vote. We're always talking about how people aren't voting. If we bring attention every 5 years to the electoral process in Plymouth and how these precincts are working and how the growth is affecting the town, it would be at the pleasure of the Board of Selectmen. Pleasure of the Board of Selectmen, if they want to appoint this committee, precinct chairs, puts a few people in, they work with the clerk to see if there's any issues that could be resolved at that time. But the most important thing that I was looking for, I don't want to get bogged down in the 5-year plan, I want to focus on that 10-year plan, that when the census comes out and those numbers are released, the selectmen will appoint a working group to work with the clerk and appointed by the precinct chairs to examine the polling to recommend. So that was my plan, and I
Doesn't
just
seem
was
to be any-
interjecting, excuse me, I just wanted to have that little 5-year little interjection, kind of a checkup. Sorry,
So,
just wanted to finish
Betsy,
what I
any
was
more
saying.
question?
I just wanted to say that I'm in favor of the 9-year.
Right, okay.
That somebody, the COPC can bring attention to
Right.
an election problem anytime.
Well, I think the way, resting 1 second, the way it's come out so far is that it'd be more flexible. And Frank's suggestion was that you could start as early as 5 years. Somebody could bring it up, maybe it's time to start looking at this, but you don't have to. You could wait if that's the prudent decision, but you have to get started at the beginning of the 9th year in any event.
Yeah, I can see doing Betsy's sit in the seat and envision it. I can see a member of the COPC saying, we're hearing some problems or issues, and they go to the select board and they say, we think this would be an opportune time to do this. And the select board, I can't see why they would have a problem with that. But if there is no issue, it doesn't happen until the year before, and then they're ready to go and roll on this, so.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Pizer, do you wish to make a comment?
I guess the concern that I have with meeting early is that it's almost a tease. I know that there are people in the public right now who think that they wish they were in a different precinct. It is the case that no one will be moved between now and 2032. That's state law. So if we meet in 5 years and start talking about what might or might not be the case, we're going to end up with people who are going to put pressure to get themselves moved. They can't be. And I'm concerned with anger on the part of the public.
Okay, any other wrestling?
Yeah, I think, I think what we're gearing towards, I think that personally, I'd like to see that in the 9th year, they will or shall create this group.
Right.
I think that we could put another paragraph saying that if the COPC or the select board find it prudent that there's something happening, I just think that I'd really like to see something in there that this group was formed before the 0 hour. So we're not going into that 10th year like we did this time.
I think
scrambling.
that's seems to be the consensus.
Yeah.
So they can start as early as the 5th year. Welcome, Libby. Good to have you with us, like from the Collins Group. Okay, I think
Hi, be here. Thank you for the welcome.
we've discussed this. I think we do have a general understanding the way we want this clause to work. More flexible than it started out, but we would basically, as early as the 5th year, the COPC and Select Board might decide to start looking at this issue.
Mr. Chair?
But by the beginning of the 9th year, they have to get started, yes.
I'd be in favor of 2 paragraphs. One, in the 9th year they shall, period. And then if the COPC or the Select Board find it prudent in between that, they can do it. But I don't want to make it so lax that that 9th year doesn't happen.
No, I think there's actually 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is what happens in the 10th year.
Yep.
And that says the process that Bill has discussed and feels strongly about. But there'd also be these other 2 paragraphs showing a further flexibility of an earlier view of the issue. 2 paragraphs. Betsy?
I just want to suggest that we just have the 9-year, simply because the charter is getting more and more complicated, it's getting longer, more pieces to it. And I think that at any time, the COPC or the Select Board can do this second
If I hear the
paragraph.
commissioners, though, they want to make further reference, Betsy, to specifically in the charter that you should start looking at it in the 5th year, specifically.
All right.
So I don't think
I don't agree, but that's
The
okay.
consensus is not to wait until the 9th year.
All right, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Bill?
So when I read this, the thing that I was trying to accomplish is that on the 10th year, obviously the census is done every 10 years. In January, if it's done in 2020, they're going to release the numbers in 2021 in January. Now, this doesn't, this option 2 says, let's get an early start on the 10-year process. I'm just trying to think about how someone might read this in the future, where it's get an early start on the process. A year before the numbers come out, this committee will meet. Goes back to what Betsy just said. You're meeting, and Larry said that in between the censuses, you don't have the numbers to change the precincts, so you can't change the precincts. You don't have any information. But the idea was to have the committee appointed at the time the numbers are out, so the committee is looking at the numbers. This is saying that in the 9th year, they'll be appointed to get an early start to look at the precincts. They won't have the numbers to do any work. And where's the reference saying that this committee will be appointed at the time the census numbers are available? I think that I don't want to get bogged down in the 5-year or the 9-year. I want to get focused on what we did in that room upstairs when we were redistricting, when the numbers were on the table.
Okay.
So we want that to happen.
Okay, so, thought we had discussed this, and I'm a little confused at where you're going, Bill, because I understand that you want to make sure that that group is formed, period, in the 10th year. I thought that the way that I saw what we were talking about is that we wanted to have something that I see the same group that is in the 9th year being the same group that is, once the numbers come in, are still going, and that they use those numbers to keep moving forward. So
So we say that. That's what I'm saying.
okay, so.
I just want to make sure that
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would make a motion that we have a section that says, in the 9th year, the COPC and the Select Board will create this board, I guess. And, to get started on the redistricting. This board will continue once they get the actual numbers. Period. New section, if the select board or the COPC finds it needed in between, that they can form that committee. That's my
Okay,
motion.
so
I'll second that, if you want a second.
any amending of that motion? Basically, as I hear what wrestling is proposing, is we have a 3-paragraph provision. The first paragraph is the 10th, basically deals with the process in the 10th year. The second paragraph has this 9-year forming of the board, and start looking at it, seeing if numbers are available. And then the third paragraph is more just a sort of optional or permissive to allow an early view if the two, COPC and select boards, so think that makes sense. So we're trying to predict what's going to happen 10 years from now. I think it needs to stay flexible and language like that. Any further discussion? Let's just have a show of hands, all in favor of wrestling's motion as articulated.
Elizabeth wants to speak.
Let's see,
Elizabeth wants to speak.
Libby?
Good
Libby, go-
evening. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yes, go
I
ahead.
just had a couple of quick comments that I wanted to draw your attention to. There is language in the language that we've drafted, and we can break it up into 3 paragraphs if you would like. But it says the precinct advisory board, the one that's convened, shall study the town's precincts and population prior to release of the final results of the decennial federal census, and then shall review the final results of the federal census upon receipt, and shall propose any changes. So the idea is that this board continues, not only is appointed in the 9th year, but continues on and does the work. So that's
Right.
why we included that information there. The only question I had when it comes to drafting is, it was a question that was raised before, and I'm not sure I heard the answer, is what board or boards is making the decision about whether or not to reconvene early? To convene in that flexible paragraph saying, could convene as early as 5 years prior to the census? Who
Board of
makes that
Select-
decision?
Board of Select.
In my motion, if either board saw fit, they could, if the COPC finds that they need to do it earlier, they have the option to go to the select board, who can, say they need it, or the select board. So either board could make that recommendation.
Can the Board of Selectmen veto the COPC if the COPC makes the request to the board and the board says it's not necessary?
Yeah, because it's the board's final decision, the select board's final decision.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've heard some explanation of wrestling's motion. We've delayed the vote. Now we're ready to take the vote on wrestling's motion. All in favor, say aye and raise your hand. Second, 2, 3, 4.
I kind of lost what was the exact wording of the motion again?
I can't hear you.
We kind of went around a couple of circles, so I lost track of the wording of the motion.
The motion, Wrestling, you want, the motion
Sure.
was,
My motion is that we have 3 sections. That first section talks about the
Right.
10th year. But the section on the 9th year, that the board would be formed by the COPC and the select board to start looking at the precincts and continue on once they get all the numbers. And that, that's section 2, and section 3 would be that if either the select board or the COPC felt it necessary before that 9th year to form that committee, that they can. The COPC can suggest it to the select board can turn it down, or the select board can say, hey, we need to do this.
right. Scott, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, all in favor? So I got 2, 3, 4, 5, and Larry Pizer, all opposed?
Opposed?
1, 2. So it looks like it's a 5-2 vote in favor. Thank you. And we fixed the appointment, multiple members language. That was fixed in the first point here. The next item to come up is just a small change in 2-2-4, which was the minutes that are being kept of the town meeting. And it used to read, such minutes shall contain at a minimum the warrant articles and the action taken on each warrant article, and we deleted where it said a summary of the discussion because it was thought that looking at the video recording that would be indexed would be a perfectly adequate way to see the course of the discussion. So that's just a small language change. The next item was the town moderator.
About that. Unrestricted public access seems to me ambiguous. In other words, PAC TV right now is unrestricted public access. Are we referring there to PAC TV?
No,
So can we be more specific?
I think we might need to, but what, that was a big point in the last discussion, that we wanted it to be more than just at PAC TV, that we wanted the town to
Yeah,
make sure that that
sentence has to do with the minutes, not the video.
No, I'm sorry,
Town clerk shall ensure
224
that
is the
detailed
video.
minutes shall be created, preserved, and stored in locations accessible for unrestricted public access.
But 224, I'm sorry, says unrestricted public viewing.
So the viewing is in the first sentence as to the video.
Right, so do we want to have the PAC TV video be the unrestricted public viewing, or do we want something else?
What else would it be? It'd be-
I mean, I thought there was some talk about the video would be somehow archived, yeah, something like that. That's what I remember discussion. That, in other words, let's say a person, for some reason, let's say PAC TV doesn't exist anymore, something happens. Did we want the town itself to have archived recordings? I mean, I just,
So we'll ask our electronic expert, Mr. Brewster.
because it is stored in a location that is
So if it's
acceptable.
archived, Ken?
accessible.
Anybody who wants to see it, just call it up at 2 a.m. or whenever they choose to view it.
See, that's where you, right now, you have to go. Right now, you gotta go to PAC TV to find it.
Yeah, I would think that the language suggests that the town must create a file that's accessible, has all documentation is supposed to be.
That is exactly what I was going for with what we talked about last.
And I don't think we need to specify, because I think the language requires that happen.
Yes,
And there's many ways that can happen, but if there was just a link on the town clerk's website where there are other links to documentation of elections and things, you could simply click on that and the video would come up.
So we're not relying on PAC TV.
I wouldn't want to rely on PAC TV. I
So do
think,
we need to say unrestricted
if-
public viewing could be PAC TV?
well, if you look, if you look at it, it says the town shall.
The
And
select
it-
board shall ensure.
if
says
the town
select
feels
board.
that that's unrestricted access, but I'm not sure it really is. It's kind of
Is
a
the
bit
language
Byzantine.
broad enough without any reference to PAC TV? It just, whatever it takes, it's got to be stored in locations accessible for unrestricted public access.
Yeah.
Whatever it takes.
It could be PAC TV then.
It
Okay.
could, I suppose, yeah.
But if that isn't work, it's got to be something else.
So,
I'm sorry. I could suggest some language.
Okay, Libby, go ahead.
We could use language such as shall be archived by the town, but accessible for unrestricted public viewing or unrestricted public access. And we could make it clear that the town is the custodian of those two items, the video and the minutes.
Larry? Mr. Pizer?
I mean, we can go into all this detail, but public records law basically suggests that all records are open unless they're designated otherwise. And this isn't designated otherwise, and therefore simply saying that the town will remain the custodian of this record means it's available to the public.
I don't think that our problem, at least my problem, isn't with the availability, it's with the storage. I want to make sure that, you know, you can go to the town website and click on the video, that the town ensures that that's available, not PAC TV ensures it's available. That was my thought.
So,
I like Libby's, because Libby was saying that, you know, her verbiage was saying that the town must ensure. I like that verbiage.
so Libby, can you take a hand and draft some language in there that gives us that assurance? And if it passes,
Absolutely.
that'd be great.
But I think, Mr. Chairman,
Yes, yes, Bill.
I think last week, Michael from the Collins Group was indicating that we're going to have some sort of digitized information where we can quickly move to different sections,
Yeah,
so.
we said that.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure that's still in
So
there.
Libby, we'll look for you to put some additional wording in there that Mr. Pizer has approved. Okay. The next item is the town moderator. We voted again at the last meeting to have the moderator election process be done by town meeting instead of a town-wide election. So we are fine-tuning the language. We also agreed at the last meeting that any registered voter was eligible to run for the position of town moderator. The actual mechanics are a little more difficult. What I'd like to do here is ask Mr. Cohan to kind of run us through a typical session, run us through let's say this is in effect, and how would it work with the next town meeting coming up?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just reading through Section 8. Maybe Libby can come up with some language that is a little clearer. I think that what I was perceiving is how one would be elected to the moderator is that you would go and get your nomination papers from the clerk. You would get your signatures, and you would give that back to the clerk. And then those names would be presented to spring town meeting. And this idea of when do we vote, in the beginning or the end? Basically, what would happen is that from the beginning of town meeting till the end of town meeting, the polls are open for a town meeting member to vote on who the next moderator is. That it's kind of like, it's when you want to vote. It would not have to be run by the moderator. It would just be an internal vote that's taken, that who the next moderator will be. And that will be announced at the end of the meeting, that this is who got the most votes, and they will assume the duties in the spring. This makes sure that if you can't stay there until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you can vote earlier and at your pleasure. That the nominations will be known well before town meeting who the candidates are. It's just they're going to this body. I thought that was a cleaner, more concise way of actually going before it. And by the way, this language references the assistant moderator. I think we should leave the choosing of an assistant moderator to the moderator that we elect, and they can choose someone to assist them like is currently done. I don't want to get 3-year term. So that was my thought, Libby. I see how it's written, and that was the thought I had.
All right, let's take this apart then. 28-5 is the assistant. Can we agree there that if we go forward with this procedure, that the moderator, whoever is elected, will choose his own assistant moderator at the following town meeting when he takes his office? So the assistant moderator would be done subsequently by the then newly elected moderator.
I'm okay with that.
I think that's.
But I think that he needs to, he can't wait till the next town meeting to do that.
Or any time between
Yeah.
then and the next town meeting.
And I really like what Bill was saying, because that takes away, you know, in thinking about this, it puts a lot of stress on the moderator to do it the way we were talking, because if he's rerunning, you know, that puts a lot of, but if there's just a ballot that, you know, everybody puts their name in, then he can do that without the stress. I really like the way that
So,
was.
so let's look at that for a second. So, Bill, do you see any place here for the introduction of the candidate as to who he is, what his qualifications are? Is he going to say anything? He's going to say, hello, I'm local. I'm a local lawyer. I want to run for moderator.
Well,
So what kind of introduction is he going to make?
I think town meeting, the business of town meeting would be to handle the business of that period. The person would take it upon themselves as a candidate to make their candidacy known to town meeting members prior to town meeting. So town meeting would have plenty of time before town meeting to know who the candidates are. They would be out there just like if you were running town-wide, but now the candidate, the audience in which the moderator candidates have to perform within is within this town meeting. So there's 130. They
You
would
have a deadline for the closing of the ballot?
correct. Just it would be like the normal spring town election.
Right. Also a deadline for announcement of candidacies.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So would this be done by email? Is that how you see that happening, to reach all town meeting members?
So it'd be the same thing as today. You can call them on the phone, you could mail town meeting members, you can call them on the phone, you could email them about your candidacy and why you want to be a candidate. And there's no reason why the committee of precinct chairs couldn't hold a little debate between the candidates prior to town meeting to hear who wants to go. So there's plenty of forums in which the candidate can get his message out.
And can anyone be a moderator that's a registered voter?
Correct.
Any registered voter? Larry? Mr. Pfizer?
Bill brought up something that needs to be fleshed out. If there is going to be a nomination process for the moderator, the deadlines cannot be the same as the deadlines for the town election, because they're usually about a day before town meeting, and it could be after town meeting, depending upon the calendar. And if there's going to be a nomination for someone elected at town meeting, I think that that has to be spelled out in the charter, because that would be the only officer of town meeting where there were nominations beforehand. It hasn't been done before. Nothing wrong with it, but we can't just.
The mechanics
say
have to be
perhaps.
spelled out in the charter.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, we could, Larry, you bring up some good points, because I was thinking that as I was talking about it, that those dates would have to be adjusted for the event of town meeting,
Right.
which we could put into the charter itself.
Libby, do you have any suggestions?
No, I think we can work with the ideas that are being put forward tonight. We can revise this and try to tie in the nomination period, and the registration of names would be verified in the same way that any elected official who is running for office, or any candidate for elected office, would be as well. At least that's what I'm hearing, is that how that's the intention, that it would be handled the same way. And then the assistant moderator is appointed by the town moderator anytime from the time when the new moderator is elected to the next town meeting. That's what I'm hearing. And then, is it are the terms the same, or are they different?
No, it would be, currently, right now, our moderator can appoint someone for that fall town meeting, or that spring town
I
meeting.
think the assistant moderator would be in sync with the moderator. They come as a pair.
Well, no, this is what I wanted to leave that alone. Currently, right now, the moderator can appoint an assistant moderator at every town meeting. It's at the pleasure of the moderator. So, I guess 6 months, because that would be the,
No,
well,
it's actually, if you excuse me, it's
Yep.
actually a year's, in the present charter, I'm quite sure it's actually a year's appointment.
Okay, then we'll leave it that way.
It could be changed to the 3 years, it could be changed to anything, but that's not where we are. Let me also mention that if we're going to follow the nominating process, nominations for town office close 49 days before the election. So I'm assuming that from what Bill said, we would do the same for moderator.
Correct. 49 days before town meeting. And then we would leave it with the moderator would be still just a year, that the moderator can appoint a town assistant moderator for 1 year duration. So if they need to change that along the way, give them that flexibility.
Right. Yep. Okay, good.
Okay. Got that language for you.
Thank you. Two things just to cover before we go on to Chapter 3, two small items. In 2-7-2, there was a sentence that Michelle actually put it in a section by itself, and I think it could be, and Collins had put the sentence over here in 2-7-2. But basically, it said that the town manager shall provide support personnel to assist COPC in carrying out the COPC's assigned duties. And you may recall that sentence. So I'm suggesting that it be the last sentence in 2-7-2 instead of a sentence all by itself in later 2-7-8. Then there was one other item, which was 2-7-3, which had to do with the Committee of Precinct Chairs listening to articles. And the language, we had two versions of it here. I just want to make sure which one the commission wishes to adopt. One said that the precinct chairs would recommend at town meeting, make recommendations on all warrant articles that it deemed to be non-financial in nature. And then another way of saying it was does not require the expenditure of town funds. So we need to get it one way or the other, or get it, the language agreed
Are you
to.
looking at memorandum 5?
Yeah, we're back to 5. Okay, I was lost too there.
Yeah.
Memorandum 5. It's different from the way that it now reads in our charter.
So wouldn't, I think we were,
So I think the two options are say non-financial in nature, that's one. The other one was, does not require the expenditure of town funds. That one, I think, is problematical, because basically anything that comes before town meeting is going to require something to be spent, whether it's Xerox pencils or anything. It's going to require an expenditure of town funds, whereas saying non-financial in nature is more generic and applies more to the, basically, to the body of the article itself, as to whether it's a financial article or not.
Yeah, I think we had agreed on non-financial in nature.
Non-financial in nature.
I think
Okay,
we had
good.
agreed on that. Didn't we agree on that?
All right, that was easy, good. So we're back to the Collins memo number 6. And the next item was on page 4, which was joint board meetings. We had asked for language directing a joint meeting of boards and committees for the purpose of budget planning, and they proposed some new language here in 3-2-8, which says the select board shall meet jointly with the school committee, planning board, and all other elected boards for the purpose of sharing information. Then it went on to say that select board shall schedule the joint meetings, which shall be held no less than twice a year, and at least one of these meetings, which shall also include the finance committee, shall be held at the beginning of the budget process, and shall be for the purpose of reviewing projections and other information relevant to the development of the annual budget. That's the new wording for our approval tonight.
Mr. Chairman?
Bill, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would elevate the Finance Committee to the same level of Planning Board, School Committee, and Select Board, that the school committee, that the Select Board, the School Committee, the Planning Board, and the Finance Committee will meet twice a year.
All at the same time?
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, it's important to have, if we're going to be doing financial planning, we need to have the Finance Committee in the room at the same time.
all right, Bill, anything else?
That was it.
Okay. So that language as modified looks good. And then it was noted, when it came to the town manager, that we needed language to establish a temporary town manager, basically to perform in that 30-day period when there could be a vacancy in the town manager himself could be, or herself could be not available. So they proposed the 3-4-4, which is on page 4. The present language is the first paragraph, and the new proposed language is that second paragraph. So here, Libby, I think what you're suggesting is that the town manager can designate by a letter filed with the select board some qualified officer of the town as a temporary town manager during a temporary absence or disability of the town manager, and it's good for 30 days, after which the select board can move in and appoint another officer as temporary town manager. So it provides for a 30-day interim type appointment.
Correct, yes?
Yes. And then it goes on to say the powers of the temporary town manager should be limited to matters not admitting of delay. No temporary town manager shall have authority to make any permanent appointments or removals from any office. And then the next paragraph is 3-4-4-B is already in our charter, right? That talks about the acting town manager. So that's already there. So the new paragraph is this temporary town manager language. Comments? Okay, seems to be
So
accepted.
just one question on that.
Yep.
So if, let's say there's a temporary town manager for 30 days and
Right.
he or she cannot remove anyone, what happens there is someone that has to be removed for some reason. Did we talk about? Yep.
The way I read that is that they can't cause that to happen. The temporary town manager can't fire somebody without cause. That's the way I'm looking at it. I'm sure a legal person would be better at that.
Libby, is that how you intended that to be when it talked about removal? It would be removal peremptory? In other words, without
So-
cause?
The idea is that the person would have to be, in reading this language, that they would be suspended, they could be suspended, but they can't be permanently removed or permanently appointed.
Okay, so the remedy of suspension would be available immediately if necessary.
Okay.
Got it, okay, thank you.
And you could remove that language if you wanted to. That tends to be language that you see in temporary appointments for any office like mayor or any other office that you
Right.
might need to
No.
fill.
No, it makes sense. I agree.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think it works. All right. And then the last paragraph there that's not italicized is already in the charter, our current charter. The next item is one we felt strongly about. This is the select board communications with town departments and employees. And there are various versions of that that I think are stronger than we currently have in a charter. One I passed out tonight that Betsy was kind enough to pull from the Dartmouth charter. But there's also another version that's even stronger that we're going to find between now and the next meeting, which basically says that the select board cannot involve itself in day-to-day stuff or communicate directly with employees without going through the town manager. It's just much more precise, mandatory, strong language. And I think we should look at that language for inclusion in our charter.
Mr. Chairman?
Bill?
I think I think we all are in agreement that that's a very important direction to go in, to establish that circumstance. And I did have a chance to quickly look over Betsy's information that she sent over. That's helpful, but obviously we want to be a little bit tighter. That's nice.
That covers some of it, but not as much as we want to go.
Correct. And then, but there's something hovering there, just something to keep in mind with my fellow commissioners, and that is that if someone is elected to office in the town of Plymouth, they have this pretty big responsibility. And constituents will call the elected person looking for some assistance. There's a light bulb out in my street, there's a pothole here, and obviously, we don't want that elected official calling and interrupting the day, a department head and instructing them to go fix that light bulb on the street pole or fix that pothole. But there should be some sort of internal system put in place that the town manager's office, will provide, legislative service, constituent services, meaning that if an elected official or a constituent has a resident has a question, there's a place that they can send that question to and get an answer. So if there's a public official and someone calls them up and says, I need help with my light bulb or the pothole, they could go to constituent services, express
Okay.
the concern. Just let me finish. Just express the concern, and then they would get an answer back that they could provide their constituents. So the elected person is responding to their constituents, and at the same time, the town is not experiencing elected officials calling different department heads, instructing them offline. But if we are going to tighten up this language to tell elected officials, this is how you interact with the town manager, and the town manager takes your concerns here, we need to kind of maybe make some reference that the town manager's office will have constituent services in place to answer elected and residents' questions, something of that nature. It's
Okay,
something
so-
just I'm batting around. I'm not suggesting anything right
We understand
now.
what you're saying, but I think and I think we need some language here.
Yep.
But I also think we need a whole chapter. And I'm excited to be able to work with Collins on this.
Okay.
For communications, the communications of the town with its residents. And that is the kind of thing I think that can be spelled out exactly what you're talking about, but it would really get highlighted that the town has that responsibility to its, instead of the other way around. So
Betsy's wants to talk.
it's going to be fun to work that language out. Betsy?
Would you like me to read you a paragraph from Pembroke? It says, "The board, working with the town manager, is responsible for policy development and review for compliance. The board is responsible for supervising the town manager, who in turn manages the departments of the general government. The town manager manages day-to-day operations," and this is from the website underneath where it says Pembroke Select Board.
Pembroke, okay.
Yeah, so the last sentence says, "Concerns and questions about the operation of departments and suggestions for improvements should be addressed to the town manager." So it's
Okay.
right as part of their
So
documentation.
can you circulate that to us, and
I
then
will,
we will
yes.
send it and see whether we can fit it
But so
within the charter?
it's quite direct, Bill, as to what you just said. It's notifying residents that any concerns and questions should be addressed to the town manager. And our last town manager, and maybe our new one will do it, I had very good success, not only doing it myself, but recommending to other residents that they email to the town manager, and she had that letter that she put out, and every single question that was sent to her, she actually listed the question and the answer. And so there was a
Report.
pickleball court question, and I said, as they came to me, and they said, "What, you're a town meeting member, what can happen?" And I said, "Email the town manager," and the town manager answered them by email and then referenced the answer in her.
No, that was, it was a great
And
report.
it was great, I
And
mean,
she
it was
answered every
wonderful.
question
She
there.
answered
That was
every
good.
single question, so I don't know if the new town manager will do that, but I found that a highly effective way to have people feel heard.
I think if we
and
develop
addressed.
this new chapter, these questions are going to come out in that whole section. It'd be interesting to see how they come out. But I think it's a very important point. Okay, there's one other kind of question here lurking that's been mentioned from time to time. I just want to get it out so we can deal with it one way or the other, but that had to do with the selectmen themselves and whether they should continue to be a 5-member board elected townwide, or whether there should be some other nature of a select person, whether they represent a particular geographic area of the town, so many precincts, or whatever. Is there any desire of this commission to look at that question?
Mr. Chairman, I had been waiting for this moment to speak of what I think would be a novel approach that actually echoes the letter we received One of the things I've always felt in observing the community is, given the size of the community and the variations in industry and commerce and tourism and just density of population, I think we have many precincts that are, if not in fact underrepresented, they feel underrepresented. They don't feel part of the community as a whole. They don't feel part of the downtown, definitely, of the historic legacy. And so more needs to be done on a proactive basis, in my opinion, to bring them into the fold on a regular basis and see their voting numbers go up. So I'm in favor of the concept of a 7-member select board. 6 would represent aggregations of 3 precincts each, so they'd be regional in their election. So you'd have the southern part of the community, as best we can, given the precincts, and the western portion and the downtown portion. And so your representative that should be chosen of those 6 would be, would at least have greater consideration and awareness and be people from those communities. And the 7th, I would suggest, would be a 1-year term for whoever is the chairman of the COPC, and that would change every year. That would be kind of like the vice president in the Senate serving in that capacity.
So, wait, Frank, you're losing me. Just lay out the attributes now again is what you're suggesting.
So
A 7-member select board.
a 7-member select board,
Okay,
6 of which are elected from
6,
6 are elected from groups of 3 precincts.
right.
So they have greater representation of the regions of this very large community. And the 7th would be the chairman of the COPC serving a 1-year term. Now that would give a true, literal seat at the table for the legislature. And perhaps there'd be some variation in their participation. Maybe they are only a deciding vote, being not elected. So they are if there's a tie of 3-3, they'd be the deciding vote. And maybe that'd be the only time they would vote, but they would participate fully.
I guess the question
Wow,
I
Frank,
have,
that sounds a lot like a,
Frank, is it safe to
No.
put the chair of the COPC on the select board, or are they going to get co-opted?
sounds a lot like a council, but that's just me.
No, I don't, it's not. It's, we have a full legislature, and we have a more powerful legislature, and we have select board members that would be more representational, again, of their communities. And I think that would be a big step forward in making people understand that the inclusivity of the participation we're looking for.
So Frank, do you foresee a lot more participation if you're making it 7?
I do.
Because I don't see a lot of people racing to be selectmen.
Well, I do think that there was a point, I know you remember, it might have been when I first started to cover the town as a journalist, when,
1902?
fairly surprising to me, but probably because they felt at that point unrepresented, there were several members from the southern portion. Mr. Muratori was one of them, a couple others. And we haven't seen that since, and we've definitely seen very poor turnout from old Precinct 9 and things like that. And I think they truly feel outside of the penumbra of what is considered by people of Plymouth. And, anything we can do to improve that level of participation, I think is important, but I think it would also be I think it would be an improvement. Right now, we still see, though we can do other things to work on participation on voter turnout, we still see the vast number of votes coming from essentially the oldest parts of town and the more densely populated areas of town. And so I think that the board is it's too many people are underrepresented on the board. But anyway, that's just.
Betsy?
Yes, I 100% agree with Wrestling that it does sound like a town council representation. This is how town councils are set up. If you look at Amherst, which we looked at quite closely,
Wait, I'm
their
not following
town.
your point.
They're-
slow down a little bit.
I'm sorry, their town council members are from various parts of town. And most town councils are set up that way. And I think the reason they're set up that way is so that there's representation from each part of town. But it makes it a lot better in a lot of ways. I really like Frank's suggestion. And by the way, I have friends and neighbors who are watching these programs loyally every week. Even if it meets twice a week, they watch the whole thing and we discuss it. And they have been very positive about the idea of representation from different parts of town. It would greatly reduce the cost of running for a select board, because you wouldn't have to send giant, expensive postcards to everybody in the town. It would also mean that people might have more buy-in, because it would be somebody, they would be from their neighborhood, so they would, the only people who would show up for select board on their ballot, similar to town meeting, would be the select board people from their, people running for select board from their district. So we would call these districts, there would be 3 of them in each district, 3 precincts, and it works very, very well. I agree with wrestling, it works very well in towns that have town council. The difference would be why it's not a town council is we also have a very strong legislature. So to say it's a town council would not be correct, but it would have the same basic reason for dividing the town into districts, and that works very, very well
There's nothing
in
legislative
those
about it.
towns. But it would not have any legislative power at all.
Bill?
I agree. I think, I agree with Frank and Betsy, and I think that it'd be interesting to hear what the other board members feel. But I would try something different, where I still believe that Plymouth, we're one community. We got to be thinking in that manner. Whether you live in North Plymouth or South Plymouth or Cedarville or West Plymouth or Manomet, you're part of this equation. And the way that they usually resolve an issue like that is, I do believe that we need to start identifying selectmen representing different parts of Plymouth, but at the same time, we would have to merge that with, if we're going to do 7 members of the board, that at least 2 of them be voted at large across the town, so that you could run in a region or you can run at large. That's how they manage the situation, so that you don't get a board of selectmen that's only concerned about North Plymouth and Cedarville and Manomet, and they're all paired off in their corner. At least you have somebody that's elected at large that has this other responsibility.
Okay, so you'd have 5 and 2.
5 and 2, I'd have,
Do you have
yeah.
The COPC chair kind of is a little bit troublesome to me, because I'm not sure you want COPC on the select board.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we want to let the COPC focus on the legislative side of the equation. I don't want to cross-pollinate there. I think the most functional thing that we should do is do exactly what Frank says, and that's like, let's get some regional representation on the Board of the Selectmen, but also maintain that larger question of that we're all in this together and we need some at-large. So it'd be 5 to 2.
I think that it makes it awkward with 18 precincts to have 5 elected officials.
Well, but Betsy, you know what I was thinking? That we stay away from that, because we don't want to start to tie these, we would have to identify precincts.
Yes,
Right.
I think we would. But so if we had 6 elected and 1 at large, that doesn't mean
Doesn't
that.
break the tie.
But that person at large doesn't mean they won't still be loyal to their own area.
I know that
Ran
that's
at
the
large.
theory, they might not
But
be.
even if they did run at large, they still may have some loyalty to their own area, because that's
Okay, so we
fairly
got a
normal.
proposal of
So-
5 and 2. Wrestling, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think this is a great discussion, and I think that Frank's got some interesting ideas that I think are great. It all comes down to that personalities are gonna be personalities. And I was talking about this last night on Talk of the Town, where, democracy is not a spectator sport. You gotta be involved, and I think anything we can do to get people involved, you're gonna get people who, Manomet's always felt like the ugly stepsister that never gets anything, and North Plymouth, gets this, you're always gonna get that. You know, no matter how many selectmen we have and where they come from, they're all gonna be pushing for their agendas. I think anything we can do to create democracy and you know, I think that it's, part of the problem is that those people who don't feel represented, go to your neighbor and get them to run. You know, I think that, you know, you have to take some responsibility in democracy, and you have to look at it, okay, you know, the Pine Hills was, you know, looked at as, you know, they've got too much representation and they're voting too much. Well, yeah, they did what you're supposed to do. They went out and voted. And anything that we can do to promote people to get involved. And, you know, I think if we have to have more selectmen and we have one from each precinct, I'm concerned that we don't have a lot of people running now, you know. If we say, you know, 7 selectmen, are we gonna get 7 selectmen? You know, and you know, where's that competition gonna come from? That's.
Actually, Rusting, I think if you have people running from different parts of town, you may have more candidates. If you had a South Plymouth candidate, I think you get more interest.
I can't remember the last time we had an uncontested selectmen's race in Plymouth. I know by opening it to 7, you could open up this scenario, but, you know, people are, like Betsy's saying, that people are paying campaigns to run for selectmen now are like $30,000. I mean, they're pretty expensive. They're getting up there. And regionalizing would control money in the process, add to greater representation, you know, across the town. But I do want to, I will have to think about it. I kind of want to have 2 at large, at least.
Right.
But we'll have to figure that one out, Betsy, I guess, based on
No,
the
I think
precincts.
there should be 2, not 1.
Yeah, I'd like to have 2 at large. Oh, Larry Pizer has his hand up.
Larry?
Let me correct Frank on one thing. The old parts of town are not outvoting the newer parts of town. If you look at the percentage turnout in the last election, the middle of Plymouth, the percentages were higher than in 1, 2, and 3, those precincts. That's one thing. The second thing is that if we went in this direction, we should, you know, I guess everything has to be regionalized. You know, why not the planning board? Why not the housing authority? Why not the redevelopment authority? I would argue against it in that we already have a regional group. That is the legislature. Town meeting is elected by precinct. The idea that somebody should be thinking of the town as a whole, I mean, we have a town manager whom we hire to think of the town as a whole. And it seems to me that the idea of a select board whose interests are not parochial, but widespread, could work. And look at the present select board. 2 of the 5 live south of the Pine Hills. So it's not as though you have to be, as once seemed, an Italian or a Portuguese from precinct 1 in order to get elected. It's been pretty widespread. If you go through the list of town meeting, select board members, I would be careful before regionalizing the select board.
Libby, can you give us some idea of other towns that have taken this route with select board members running from different areas?
Well, you know, this is a little bit of a unique proposal, so I definitely have to go back and research and take a look at some, you know, Amherst is one that I believe has a similar situation, but with a town council. You do tend to see the regionalization more in a town council than a board of selectmen. So would you be interested in communities that do this in a town council form, or are you only interested in communities that do it in a board of selectmen form?
No, I think 100% saying On the executive branch, because we obviously do have town meeting members now who are all representing specific precincts. But the idea was to have one board on the executive side that also had different constituencies across the town. I don't think a planning board really
Yeah.
fits that category.
I will definitely do a little digging and research, and we can let you know in our next memo about other towns that might do something similar, but nothing comes to mind for me.
Mr. Chairman? Libby, I think that we need to look at both town meetings if it exists out there. I know we are charting new territory with this examination. So when you look across the Commonwealth, I'd look at both, council, council and, like, what you referenced Amherst. Amherst was a
So that's a council.
council. So I guess I wouldn't limit your search just to this regionalization of selectmen on a town meeting. See how they do it on a council level, see if there's something that we can't do to accommodate that. But to Larry's points, I would stay away from regionalizing our redevelopment authority or planning board. What I was trying to find on the executive level, is there a way that we can give greater representation to different parts of Plymouth because of,
But Bill, I don't think a council, in a town council form is a good model that we're
examinate?
talking about.
Okay, all right. I didn't want Libby to be limited in her research.
Well, I'm sure you
Mr.
find all
Chair.
kinds of- I mean, we know
I'll
all
see if we-
kinds of city councils and town councils that have ward councilors that represent wards, and,
Right.
I mean, that's kind of one of the worst things I think we want to see happen in Plymouth.
Okay.
Mr.
Okay.
Chair, if I may,
Yes.
I think it's extremely interesting that what Frank originally proposed is looking like a council. And I just think it's interesting that what Frank wants to do is have equal representation throughout, in the executive board. I'm just saying that it's interesting that where Libby just said, do you want me to look at council as well? I think we should, just to see how it works and see the differences of what we want and a council. I just think it's interesting that the conversation, what Frank wants and a council aren't that far away. And I totally, see where Frank's trying to go, but I just think it's interesting, and I think that we should limit Libby's, excuse me, Libby's research.
Yeah, and I'm not interested in what it looks like. I'm interested in what it accomplishes for the effectiveness, not only of government in its actual processes, but in its encouragement of the community. Again, you can't undervalue the impression that we and our form of government give to the community. They need to feel they're part of it. They need to feel that they're part of the entire community. And anything we can do in that regard, you cannot put a high enough value on. I mean, as you say, it's a participant sport. You have to get in there, but we can't just be complacent about that happening. We have to do whatever we can. I'm not concerned as well that we look at councils and see how they are shaped, or how they make that appeal to people. I know, in large part, what I think is that taking the best of a council, which is that representation, and adding it to an active legislature makes us twice as good.
Yeah, but I think the key, Frank, is that you're talking about an executive branch functions, not the legislative functions. I mean, I can see so many cities and towns near Boston that have city councils with ward bosses, basically. You can't go into their ward without their approving the project that you're trying to get
Yeah,
permitted.
and we're working actively to not let that
So
happen.
we don't want that kind of.
No, we don't want that kind of thing at
We
all.
want the
We're-
executive branch who's doing the
we-
long-term planning to have a local representative.
We were just
in each
talking
area.
about how we're going to do whatever we can to keep that separation between the
Right.
executive branch,
Yeah.
and they're visionary,
Yep.
and the kind of micromanaging that goes on. We don't want to see that happen, because it's not very efficient to begin with,
Terrible.
anyway. But I would also be amenable to a single at-large in a 7. It doesn't have to be a COPC. I thought that was a novel idea, you know.
Vice President of the Senate.
We rely on you for your ideas.
So Libby, looks like you can maybe give us some stimulating thoughts about this for next meeting.
I'd be happy to put something.
Thank you.
Can we get both the best of both worlds?
Then the next item, you're venturing, well, before we get to the planning department, there were 2 points here that actually commissioners wanted to bring up. This is probably as good a place as any. One is whether the charter should have a provision in it that deals with town council and the hiring of town council. And whether, first, is that a suitable subject for the charter? And secondly, if it is, what should we say about it? Sometimes things that you might not think should go into the charter, there's such a need at the time that we put them in the charter, just for that reason, to highlight them, to say, hey, here's something you should pay attention to. So one item I've heard a lot about is town council and how we go about it. Comment? Bill? Council. Town council. No, it's not in there now. Question is whether we want to say anything about town council, or we just go on to the next.
He's talking about lawyers.
You're talking about who
Yeah,
hires.
COUNSEL. council.
Yes, so,
You're talking about who
I was-
hires.
You're stuck on council. I've got it.
You're talking about who hires them, Bill? You're talking about who hires the
How
council?
they're hired, whether
Yeah.
How they're
they're
hired.
in-house, whether
I do-
they're
I
a
do-
law firm.
yeah, so this is, I do think we should look at this. I think that however we decide, right now, currently, the Board of Selectmen is in charge of council. The town manager works with council, department heads work with council. Currently, our council we've had now for 30-something years. They've never had to come up for a review. There's no internal process, no fail-safe system to examine council and their performance. I think that we, currently, the council is just kind of serving at the pleasure of the board and the department heads and the town manager. And I think we need to trigger something that at every 3 years, the town manager will be required to bring a report to the Board of Selectmen on the performance of council, their cost, their performance, and at that time, the select board would have to continue with that council or instruct the town manager to look at other options for council. Because right now, there is no public review of our council. Now, Mass General Law, under the procurement side of the equation, doesn't require us to put it out to bid and go back out every couple of years. They're exempt. But we should have some process publicly that would bring this question to the attention of the residents and all the participants in this form of government. Because right now, we're just kind of going from year with council.
I agree 100%. I think that there should be, maybe every 3 years or whatever the period, an audit of the performance, costs, and a public hearing as well, where people could comment, because oftentimes people feel really on the outside of town council, that they represent the town and not the people. And so I think a public process and an audit of their performance on a regular basis and a review of their contract is a healthy thing to do.
Comment, wrestling?
Yeah, I would love to entertain the discussion of in-house counsel, because one of the biggest complaints that COPC had, and a lot of town folks have, is they have no access to town council. I remember COPC, I can't remember what we were doing, but we were doing something, and someone said, ooh, not sure that's legal. And Alan was the chair at the time, and Alan said, I went to, the town manager and said, I need to get access to town council. She basically said, it's way too expensive, we can't do it. So there, you know, a lot of town people, you know, when we're doing caucuses, when we're doing things, you know, there's a lot of times where, you know, committee of precinct chairs or even a precinct chair needs legal advice. And, you know, there has been a lot of discussion about in-house counsel. And it, you know, through that audit, we might find that might be cheaper.
Mr. Pizer?
I think what Frank said is actually true. Town council really does represent the town and not the people of the town. The town council is basically the creature of the town manager. I'm concerned with the idea that other people can get their fingers in there in cost. You know, use of counsel is very expensive. I know internally, when I was clerk, if I needed advice of counsel, I had to request that. And it's the case with any group that has to request that. I'm not sure that the issue really is in-house versus a law firm. The real question is how much town council is going to be used as far as cost is concerned. If you look at the cost of town council in the previous years, our previous town manager was pretty litigious and was not particularly willing to settle matters. And that was where the cost of counsel came in. But I'm pretty leery of having us as the Charter Commission trying to make that decision. The decision's going to be made in terms of the budget. You give the town manager X number of dollars, and that's the most that person can spend. The idea that the town manager might want to make a report, there's no problem with that. But I'm concerned about taking control away from the single authority. Thank you.
Well, just one point, that maybe this is another subject that we can fold into this chapter on communications and dealing with the residents, the town reaching out to its residents and trying to perform useful services and being forward-looking, because, you know, it shocks me the lack of any kind of cooperation or aid a citizen gets when he's trying to prepare a petition for town meeting. Simple questions on how to do it, how to prepare a town meeting article that requires not a lot of legal help, but something, you know, somebody to look at it, just somebody that understands the process. And it's very uninviting the way it's done now. It's very anti-democratic, if you want to say it. A lot of people get discouraged. They don't even bother putting in a petitioned article because they know it's going to fail over the language, and not being lawyers, you know, it never makes it to town meeting. So maybe this is an area that we can deal with by saying it's a function that's got to be in the communications. And yes, I agree, the town manager should be responsible for how the council services get performed. And I have to say, this current newly appointed town manager was very receptive to the idea that this commission look at the whole question of council, because he thought there was a place for great savings, much more efficient use of council, and yes, making council much more readily helpful to the residents.
Mr. Chairman?
Bill?
On top of that, Larry, my concern was focused around the word that you used earlier, that the town council is the creature, pretty much the creature of the town manager. And that's what I want to address, that yes, the town manager is going to have to make the call when a question comes from a department to the town manager to determine the legal questions around what's being asked of them. I'm not recommending that we get involved in that process of the town manager working with department heads and working with the selectmen on council. What I was asking is that we have some kind of a fail-safe measure. Every 3 years, there's a public hearing where the town manager goes before the board of selectmen and presents a performance of how much council has cost, how many cases they've had. And then if the Board of Selectmen at that time is happy, they'll say, we'll continue with council. Or, you know something, we need to look at in-house counsel, or we need to look at another firm. Now we need to instruct you. I think we need to force the question every 3 years rather than the question never being risen, because we've had this one council now for close to 20, 30 years, I think. And I think that we need to be attentive to that. By the way, as Bill is talking about this idea of having legal services available for town meeting, that's a really big time where people are petitioning articles. We have a petitioned article process so that the residents can participate in town meeting. We should make that more, you know, the town, you know, have some language in there that says that council will provide legal assistance when the warrant is open to any resident that's asking about petitioned articles. You know, that could be something that's negotiated with the contract with the council, that during, when the warrant is open and someone is gonna get an article and petition the town, that they do have someone to call and say, you know, this is my language. Because often these petitioned articles get drafted, people do all this work, it gets to town meeting floor, council sees it for the first time and says to them, this can't go forward, and all that work was for naught. So I think that what Bill is touching on about having legal services available to town meeting in a cost-efficient way might be more beneficial than letting people petitioned article without any legal input.
Libby, I forgot to ask Mike, your director, whether there's any charters you know that do have counsel, lawyer counsel in the charter itself with a reference.
There are some. I'm thinking of mostly cities now.
Yeah, if you let us know what they say, that would be very interesting.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
can
Did you
provide that.
also, I see your hand is up as well.
Yes, I just wanted to just offer a couple of considerations. When it comes in, I am a lawyer, so I'll just make that disclosure up front, and I have worked for many cities and towns. In a prior lifetime, I was counsel for many cities and towns. So just a couple of considerations for the commission. One is that, you know, an 3-year review of having, you know, your counsel, having something like that in place as a process or procedure, you know, isn't a bad idea. The only thing I would mention about the audit is there are some times, first of all, you want to be very careful in terms of, you know, what can be divulged publicly about litigation. Litigation's an exemption generally from the open meeting law, and you have to, when you're looking at costs associated, you're going to have to look at cases. There are reasons cases don't settle. You know, how much information do you want to be publicly debated as part of an audit of performance? There's so many things that go into legal fees about why something might settle, why something might not settle, why something's dragging on, why you choose to initiate a case. Your legal budget from year to year has so many factors, and many of those factors would be attorney-client privileged in terms of why cases are going forward. You know, you would hate for anyone to look at a caseload and say, you know, why wasn't this case settled, or why are we pursuing this, and then start second guessing the town's legal strategies. So just, you know, just about a consideration from an attorney point of view about an audit of legal costs. The other thing I would mention is when you talk about petitioned articles, there are many variations of petitioned articles that you will see, and not all of them, if I was representing a town, not all of them would I feel, most of them I would say I would not feel comfortable advising if my client is the town, because some of them can have negative impacts upon the town. So I would just be very careful about asking or putting anything in the charter, or even if it's by ordinance or whatever it is, that compromises the client-attorney relationship and the duty to represent the client. The client is the town, and making the client the resident could be problematic. You know, if a resident is bringing forward a petition, perhaps the moderator, you know, I don't even want to speculate at this point because, like I said, some petitions really aren't in the town's best interest or helpful to the town. So I'm not sure, you know, how it would be framed. I'd really have to think about that, but I would have real concerns about having the client relationship jeopardized by expanding it to residents. That's really tough. But just some considerations.
Libby, that's very good advice. Thank you. I think you're right. I think we need to stay away from the word audit. I think that it might be something that the board would have a hearing to discuss the performance and what information that the selectmen find deemed appropriate, or the town manager. But I do believe that we should visit this subject every 3 years, and the language that we have around that should not put our council or current litigation in any negative disposition. So I agree with that. That's very good advice. And then the thought too is maybe it's once a petitioned article is submitted, that council will review it. I think at that point, once it's submitted, the warrant is closed, the article has been petitioned, I think it's important that council take a look at that as soon as possible, because far too many times we get into a situation on the floor at town meeting where some petitioned article is then pulled at a later date. So maybe that might be the issue to address petitioned articles, making sure they get reviewed in a timely manner.
Let's just take a pause here to see if we have any public comment. Okay, so we'll continue the discussion. Within this part of the charter, is it appropriate, I guess this is a question, for us to look to see how the town is organized, or is that basically the town manager's function? For example, there's been talk about where the conservation belongs in terms of the town departments. Is that getting down into the weeds too much?
What was this?
Whether the charter should address questions of department organization or reorganization, and how the departments are set up, or is that?
Yeah,
it's
I don't want.
obviously the town manager's job to do that.
Yeah, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole and try to get into the weeds and micromanage things, but I do believe.
You're mixing your metaphors there.
I'm mixing my metaphors, I'm being told. But I truly believe that the Conservation Committee should be an independent entity in this town, and it should not be under the Planning Department. And I think that they have a Mass General Law that they're required to implement, and they should do it in the manner in which their sole function is on that question. This obviously frees up the Planning Department to focus on planning, because that's what their office is, at the Office of Planning and Development. And we want the Office of Planning and Development to be focused on the planning process. And I don't think that would be micromanaging to look at something of that nature, because in other towns, they do it that way.
I would like to see more conservation agents in a town with 300 and something ponds. I don't know how many miles of coastland, wetlands, rivers, brooks,
Right.
streams. I think, and I've spoken to the conservation agent. He's an environmental lawyer. He's really great. He loves the town. He works hard. But there's just absolutely no way that he can, by himself, with whatever support staff, manage the conservation issues in a town this size. I'd like to see 3 conservation agents, but I don't know if that would go into the charter.
That's up to the town manager.
Town meeting, town manager.
Yeah.
We're really getting into the weeds if we talk
Yeah,
about that.
we wouldn't go there.
And if you're talking about conservation, then why not talk about all the others? So I think you're starting to go down a rabbit hole.
I'm fine with
understand
that.
where you're coming from, but I don't think it's the charter's business to be doing
Yeah.
that.
We had David Gould here, remember, we talked, and his department isn't even mentioned in the charter.
Yeah. He's not even mentioned, he was developed. My point is, wrestling, is that I want to make sure that the planning department has all the tools it needs to begin. We really need to look at the planning department in terms of the functionality of it and focusing its attention on planning and development and good planning and good development. Meanwhile, I think the Conservation Commission should simply be on its own to do its work in that manner. I think it's a concern I've had for quite some time, because in other towns, it's done that way.
But is that a charter business?
I believe it should be, yeah. Because in the past, we had a town manager who wanted to do it, and there's been other discussions about it over the years. So I think it's time that we address it in the charter. I actually think that we should be looking at that section of the charter that pertains to the planning department.
Perfect segue, Bill, because that is the next section, and the question is whether we want to take it out of this executive branch and put it in its own chapter and elevate it even more in importance. And it's interesting that the Collins Group found our current language as the most, some of the most robust language establishing a town's planning board that they've seen, which is really something, but we obviously want to do more, because the master plan in the town is not working. And although we wrote pages into the charter, and in fact, that whole section of the charter on planning was drafted with the help of the planning board the last time around. I remember how it happened. They actually prepared drafts of how they thought the charter should address planning. And much of it got into the charter, and a lot of it was great, but none of it's been followed, particularly the way the master plan works and decisions having to be made consistent with the master plan. So this area of the planning board is really important. I think it's important enough to devote a whole meeting to it. But what we need is some drafts language that we can be looking at to see if we want to add it to our current charter. Libby, I see your hands up.
Thank you. I will say that the trend tends to be to remove these department descriptions out of the charter and put it into an administrative code or put it into ordinance. So it's basically giving the town more flexibility to decide as it goes on and reorganize as is required, sometimes by budget, sometimes by size, and restructure the departments as needed. That being said, of course, it's the commission's discretion about how they want to handle that. But generally, when I'm working with charter committees, there's interest in removing that out of the charter and giving the town or city more flexibility by using an ordinance or an administrative code for organization for departments.
That's very interesting to me, Mr. Chairman. If we were to say that we have interest and a focus on removing some of the activities of the executive board where they shouldn't be, I would say, from my experience, limited though it may be, on the planning board, that the opposite is in effect, that we should have a greater participation in the shaping of the town's future, and it should be more specifically delineated what those authorities or powers are. And I'm not sure if that necessarily contradicts what Libby is saying in removing things from the charter itself. But I have a feeling, seeing the trends that I've seen, that what towns are after when they remove the specifics of what the planning board can or should do from the charter and give them the flexibility. I've heard that phrase used a lot. I've heard that the planning board needs to be more flexible in our dealings with commercial interests, and we should allow these things to proceed on their own, laissez-faire. And so we're not going to get into it in detail tonight, I don't believe, but I think it's worthy of, at the very least, a full period of discussion of what we can and should do with the planning board.
And Frank, without putting you on the spot, but you are now on the planning board. You're also very articulate writer and draftsman, could you maybe
I could
prepare
create a
notes or-
controversial document. That's
He used to
very
do one
easy.
every week in the paper.
Because you know,
Yeah,
you-
no,
you-
I would love to really get to that, because, again, I think, we are listed, and people have argued with me online that we aren't an executive board. We are, at least in our charter. The planning board and the select board are the two executive boards in the community. And as you say, the master planning is such a potentially critical factor. It hasn't been one, but it should be. So yes,
So it'd be wonderful if you could prepare, just make some notes that we can develop into
I'd
make our
love to
language
see,
even more robust.
I'd love to see the planning board more involved in town meeting. I think that is one of the groups that, we should call up. At this special town meeting, planning board should be involved in that.
Absolutely.
very much so.
Because the question should be asked, okay, if we don't approve this, what's the possibility of a developer getting that 60 lots? And that's directly to the planning board.
directly, yes.
Yeah, I think, in a great democracy, I see the planning board being asked, they should be standing at town meeting.
Yeah, I think,
I'll tell you very interestingly that I have been able to participate in town meetings because this virtual meeting has meant that I don't get an invitation. So I was very disappointed in not being able to participate in the last, at least be there in case I would wish to comment or be asked a question. Sorry, Bill.
Mr. Chairman, I think we're touching on something that's pretty relevant, and that is town meeting's relationship with the planning process. And Libby, one of the things that we struggle here in Plymouth is we're the fastest growing town in Massachusetts, and we've brought on more commercial and residential development than any other town, and that is requiring us to pay a great deal of the planning process because it has effect on our cost of services. I think that's why we're elevated in our interest in this process. And I think that some of the language could be, if it's in the charter, we can make reference to, just like we're saying that the FinCom has to hear non-financial, why we should be making the planning board has to render opinion on zoning, any zoning article that's going to town meeting, because we have Article 1 going to this town meeting, and we don't have really an opinion from the planning process.
Planning board should have been leading
Yeah.
the charge.
So we need to put that in the charter so that if there's an article going to town meeting and it's about zoning, or about zoning bylaw change, and then brings me back to the reference that we've been talking about at great length about this idea of putting in there the master plan process. That master plan process has to be coupled in the end with action items of changing our bylaws to make the master plan a reality. Just doing a master plan and leaving it on a bookshelf doesn't get anything done.
Betsy,
This is a good place for me to talk about a phone call I received from a resident, Roger Jansen, who lives on Old Sandwich Road. He suggested that we consider, besides the 5 elected planning board members, that the COPC appoint 2 more planning board members from the COPC, so that there is liaisons from the COPC on the planning board, but also representing town meeting in the sense that they would have an input into the planning. And so he thought, he watches every one of our meetings, he's given me lots of ideas, but he asked me to particularly present this one on the planning board, that 2 members of the planning board would be from the COPC.
right?
So there'd be 7 members in all, the 5 elected and the 2 COPC.
Libby, when it comes to charter enforcement, one of the key things that is very disturbing is that the master plan is not followed. That doesn't kind of fit the sort of enforcement that we've been talking about anyway. So there maybe has to be another process put in place to be sure that the master plan is followed. One way possibility would help was every time that a zoning article is presented, the planning board has to personally sign a certification that it's consistent with the master plan, or they're not, or they don't support it. I think we need more public demonstrations of following the master plan and doing what the charter says, and signing a absolute certification where they sign it, that they are certifying it. I think that would certainly help. How have other towns, I mean, you said that following the master plan is a constant problem in the state. How have other towns addressed it?
It's very difficult to create an enforcement for the master plan. I am curious to know, because really that's charged to the executive branch usually to do some implementation, and lots of factors could influence why a master plan is followed or is not followed, or is implemented or not implemented. I'm wondering about your master plan task force and whether or not there's any interest in a master plan implementation committee. What is the establishment do?
Yeah, it looks like you're asking us to let you know more about our master plan process, right?
Yes.
Is there anybody here that is more familiar with it than Frank? Maybe we need somebody actually to come here and tell us.
The process of the
Involved
master
in it.
plan, you mean the creation, development, implementation? There actually was a implementation process. Again, it was just on paper. And, but I can see, I like the suggestion of an implementation group, but probably not one made from whole cloth, one that is has representation from the boards that are most relevant to the implementation. So the planning board, the select board, the finance committee, probably a COPC member, you know, to have a nice broad basis of people from different perspectives. Because when you actually talk about, I like the idea of the certification as well, but that's I think what you would end up with is a lot of 3-2s, 4-1s, you know, votes on whether something should be certified. It depends on what perspective you're bringing to it. Obviously, a certain development might be a part of the commercial aspect of a master plan, but so it would be a very subjective decision, but all the things that we can do to make that happen, but mainly making sure you follow through on these things that you said you were going to do. I mean, the Pine Hills and Chiltonville and the eco-region, all those things were mentioned in our original master plan. It was such a prescient, wonderful actual plan that if we had followed, we would be sitting pretty right now.
So that was going to just bring up that plan that was worked on in the early 2000s was quite impressive, and from there, they were able to build village steering committee master plans from that. But we do have to put something in the charter that does make reference to the idea that every 5 years we'll update our master plan, and we should make some reference to who's going to be on such a committee. But we shouldn't forget that we need to have people at large, because I remember during that early 2000s planning process, I think Enzo Monti was the chair of that time. There were quite a few people appointed at large, and that was really, it brought the process to life, hearing from a lot of different residents about that, the future of the master plan. But like I said before, with the results of this master plan, we can give some direction in the charter that it needs to be done every 5 years. These are who will sit on it. These are things that we can do. But in the end, the results of that there need to be some identification to action items of actually changing our bylaw to make that master plan a reality. I think that has to be part of this process too, that it's not just about do a master plan. It's as a result, every 5 years you'll do a master plan, you'll appoint these people, they'll have this process, but as a result, when the master plan is completed, that it has to be reviewed to see what articles will go to town meeting to change the bylaws to make this master plan a reality.
Betsy?
I like Frank's idea of the planning board, or maybe it was Bill, to certify that this, whatever comes to town meeting, meets with the policies of the master plan. But I think it's even more, it's as important to reference to town meeting where in the master plan it is, to familiarize town meeting members with the master plan. Because if not, if it's just, oh yeah, it's a rubber stamp by the planning board, then they don't become familiar. And I know as chairman of the Open Space Committee, that was my first real working with the master plan as we developed the open space plan. And I'm thinking that the master plan is due to be completely updated, is it not? Is it 2025? And so we should be starting a committee right now. I mean, it's a huge job. I don't know whose job it is to start that committee, but let me
No.
read you what Sharon has.
It's underway.
It's underway, good. Sharon says, under Select Board, work with boards and committees to assure Sharon Master Plan's timely and comprehensive implementation, complete rewrite of zoning regulations. So the Select Board
Select
was
board should definitely play a role.
charged with making sure that the master plan was implemented, but also making sure that zoning regulations
Ooh.
matched
Right.
the master plan.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so that's
Because
in
this
the, that's
this is
in
what
the
Frank's talking
Sharon.
about, the certification. Frank mentioned that, and we need to have that as a rationale for any changes to the bylaw.
So
Yeah.
that's in the charter.
Yeah.
I mean, that's in the, under Select Board in the Sharon
Right.
webpage. I'll send that webpage to everybody so you can look at it.
That would be helpful. And I think right now, like Frank just indicated, that the planning process has begun. The planning board has appointed a committee to start looking at how this process will evolve.
Well,
Eventually-
actually, the beginning is a gap analysis
Yeah.
where they're looking back at why we failed to implement the last one.
Okay.
That's going to be quite the task.
Right.
But one of the reasons we did that, though, is there was no real support, and we need financial support to move the master plan forward. And they said they didn't have the money right now.
So that's what I was about to say, that right now, you're beginning the planning process, you're working on the gap analysis, it's gonna give you some indication of what direction you're gonna go in, but now you're gonna have to go back to town meeting. Whenever we have the planning process here in Plymouth, we go with town meeting with an article to find the funding, to hire the firm to come in, to work with all these different groups to consolidate the plan into something that we can work with. This group could also work on the bylaw changes that we might see necessary. But I think that in the charter, not only to call for this planning process to begin, but also indicate that there'll be, funding available for the planning process, because that's a major component of the planning process. You're going to have to spend money on a plan, you're gonna have to spend money on developing bylaw changes to go to town meeting, so you're gonna have to do your due diligence on the front end of this.
Okay, let's summarize. I think chapter 2 is in pretty good shape. We covered the items tonight. They were still needed some cleanup, and I think we did that. I think chapter 2 is getting nearly completed, but we've opened a lot of issues now in chapter 3, so please, that's what we've got to work on between now and the next meeting, including and planning is very important. It'd be great if we could see some language before the next meeting on the planning, but we could add to that section in the charter and perhaps make a new chapter for planning. I think that's, we will bring it to tonight. Moving back to our agenda, the minutes for June 6th will be ready presumably at our next meeting. Is there any old business? Any new business? Any other business?
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, so the next two meetings are Thursday, June 23rd, and then Monday, June 27th, both post the town meeting that's coming up. There being any other business, Libby, thank you very much for coming tonight. Appreciate it. So I think we're. Thank you. Larry, are you raising your hand? Nope. So a motion would be in order.
Motion to adjourn.
It's been moved and seconded to adjourn. All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you. We'll see you in 2 weeks.